Somewhere in the heart of the jungle, amid the cries of birds and the rustling of leaves, a tiger was wandering. His gait was uneven, and he was limping noticeably. His front right leg was swollen and causing him excruciating pain. There was a terrible swelling on it, hot, reddened, with a yellowish fluid under the skin. The fur around it had completely fallen out, and the skin was stretched to the limit. Everything pointed to accumulated pus that was about to burst out. It was an adult male, once a formidable hunter, now a vulnerable and weakened creature. Every step was difficult. He stopped several times, raising his head as if trying to hear something through the sounds of the jungle. But all he could hear was his heavy breathing and the beating of his heart. Finally, he lay down under the trees, hiding in the shade from the heat. He stretched his front leg forward, and against the dark ground, the swollen area looked particularly ominous. The pain burned from within, but the tiger was not giving up yet. A rescue team was sent to this part of the jungle after reports of an injured tiger. They combed the area for several hours until they came across the emaciated predator lying under thick undergrowth. The tiger was barely breathing. Its paw was swollen and inflamed, and its eyes were cloudy with pain. The rescuers approached slowly, keeping their distance, until one of them, an experienced field veterinarian, approached with a medical kit. He knelt down next to the injured paw and quickly examined the swelling. It was a purulent inflammation, dangerous and advanced. Slowly but surely, he picked up a lancet. The rest of the team held the tiger in place so that it would not move. With one precise and deep movement, the veterinarian opened the swelling. Thick yellow-green pus spurted out of the open wound with a squelching sound. It ran down the paw, staining the fur and the ground. The tiger jerked and growled, but did not attack, as if he understood that he was being saved. Antiseptics and bandages were already being prepared next to the wound. The animal had a long road to recovery ahead of him, but the first, most painful step had already been taken. After the forest rescuer carefully opened the tumor on the tiger's front leg with a lancet and all the pus drained out, the team moved on to the next, equally important stage. They poured an antiseptic solution on the wound to prevent infection. The scorched forest air was filled with the smell of iodine and medicine mixed with damp earth. The tiger, immobilized by sedatives, lay quietly, breathing evenly. One of the rescuers carefully applied sterile gauze to the wound and began to wash the edge of the incision. The others prepared bandages and laid out their instruments. Despite the rough conditions in the middle of the forest, everything was done as cleanly as possible. Each step was carefully measured. When the wound was completely cleaned, the rescuer took a sterile bandage and began to carefully wrap the tiger's paw. Each layer was laid evenly, covering the wound like a shield. It was clear that everyone around felt relieved. The worst was over. Now the tiger had to be taken to the clinic, but its leg was already securely fixed. The tiger had already been bandaged, but the rescuers knew that this was only the first step. The wound was no longer festering, but the animal needed qualified help at a clinic. They carefully brought the stretcher closer, placed soft cushions under its paws, and began to lift the tiger's heavy body. The weight was not only physical. There was tension in the air. Would they manage to get the tiger to the clinic before the sedative took effect? The road was uneven, covered with roots and grass, but every step was taken with care. One rescuer constantly monitored the tiger's breathing, while another checked the bandage to see if blood was seeping through. After a few hundred meters, they came out onto an old country road where a car with an open trunk was already waiting. The wind rustled the tree branches, and the sun was setting behind the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange color. They lifted the tiger inside and carefully secured it so that it would not be injured during the journey. One of the rescuers sat next to it, keeping his hand on the animal, as if he did not want to let go for a second. The tiger was on its way to safety. The car braked sharply at the gates of the veterinary clinic. At that moment, veterinarians in white coats ran out of the building, carrying IV drips, flashlights, and medicines. One of them already knew the tiger's story. He had been informed by radio. The others had not yet seen the wound, but it was clear from their expressions that they were all ready to provide emergency care. The car door was opened, and the rescuers coordinated to pull out the stretcher. The tiger did not move, only his chest rose and fell slightly. The bandage remained dry, but the smell of old pus still lingered in the air. They carried him into the operating room. The light from above was blindingly bright. The veterinarians began to remove the bandage, carefully cutting the bandages so as not to disturb the fresh wound. One doctor turned on a magnifying lamp to examine the remains of the inflammation. Under the bandage, it was clear that the tumor had been opened, but there was still some swelling around it. The doctor cleaned the edges of the wound, washed it with peroxide, and began re-antiseptic treatment. Then, he carefully applied a special anti-inflammatory gel and began to bandage it again, now with a sterile multi-layer bandage, specially designed for large cats. The tiger lay quietly, as if he understood that all this was being done to save him. Several weeks passed. All this time, the tiger was under the supervision of veterinarians and rescuers. He was treated, fed, his wound was carefully dressed, and his bandages were changed frequently. At first, he could barely move, just lying there and watching people with a wary gaze. But day by day, he grew stronger. His appetite returned, his fur began to shine, and even his eyes regained their predatory sparkle. The wound on his front leg had almost completely healed. There was no trace left of the large, purulent tumor, only a thin, barely noticeable scar. Sometimes he would approach the bars of the enclosure and look at the forest beyond the fence, as if remembering the smell of freedom. The rescuers noted that the tiger had made a full recovery, and that it was now time to release him back into the wild. Dawn broke. The car with the cage drove towards the very thicket where he had been found. When they arrived, the rescuers silently surrounded the cage. One of them, the one who had cut out the pus in the forest with a lancet on the first day, knelt down next to it. He looked into the animal's eyes and whispered, "You did it. It's time." The door opened. For a few seconds, the tiger just sat inside, as if he couldn't believe it. Then he took a step, then another. He breathed in the fresh air, sniffed the ground, and looked at the rescuers one last time. No roar, no fear, only respect. And finally, he slowly walked forward, disappearing among the tall grass and trees. The rescuers stood silently for a long time. One of them discreetly wiped away a tear, another smiled through the tension. And the one who had been with him from the beginning said, "Now you're home again. And may your scar never remind you of the pain, only of victory."